It was a cold evening in the dying light of a prairie sunset. The kind of silence that presses against a man's soul when he has lived too long with only cattle and fences for company, and old Samuel Briggs knew that silence too well. For 20 years he had run his ranch with no children and no wife, just endless fields of dust and the weary breath of the wind rattling against rotting barn doors. And on that evening, when he walked into the tiny town auction house, he didn't go looking for anything but feed for his horses. Yet fate has a cruel way of bending paths, because sitting on the stage, head bowed, hair tangled, was a girl, no older than 20. Her wrists marked by rope burns, her dress faded and torn, and her voice barely more than a whisper when the auctioneer joked grimly that she was there because no one else wanted her. $1, the man sneered. Who'll give $1 just to take the trouble off our hands? And no one raised a hand, no one spoke, for the town had grown cold, practical, and cruel, but Samuel, who had lived in silence too long, felt something twist deep in his chest, something that remembered his late wife's eyes before she died of fever, something that remembered what it was to be human. And before he could stop himself, his rough, calloused hand went up and he said, "I'll give $1, his voice echoing against the wooden beams, and laughter rippled through the crowd, cruel and mocking, because who would pay for such a broken thing? But Samuel didn't hear them. He only saw the way the girl lifted her face, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Please, just make it quick." And in that moment Samuel understood that she thought she had been bought for death, that her eyes, haunted, hollow, yet burning with the last ember of dignity, expected nothing more than another cruel man to take what little life she had left. And for a long second Samuel stood there staring, his throat dry, and then he said words that would change everything. "Girl, you're coming home to be free." And the hall went silent, some mocking, some sneering, some scoffing, but Samuel didn't care. He paid his $1, took her hand gently, and led her out into the prairie night where the skies stretched endlessly, and she stumbled beside him, whispering again, "Why didn't you just end it? I was ready. You could have made it quick." And Samuel stopped, turned to her with the weight of years in his voice, and said, "Because the world already tried to kill you, child. My job's to make sure it don't succeed." And for the first time, her tears came, hot and uncontrollable, breaking through the dam of silence she had carried, and she collapsed against him as the prairie winds howled like ghosts across the grass. And from that night on, Samuel became not a buyer but a savior, teaching her to ride, to mend fences, to cook hearty meals in the quiet warmth of his ranch, speaking little but showing through every gesture that she was safe, that she was more than what they had made her believe. And in the stillness of those lonely plains, the two broken souls began to mend one another, he with his decades of silence, she with her shattered youth. And though the townsfolk whispered, mocking the old man who paid $1 for a girl no one wanted, they did not see the light slowly returning to her eyes, nor the way Samuel began to smile again when the sun came up, nor the quiet prayers of gratitude whispered each night before sleep. For sometimes salvation costs no more than $1 and the courage to defy cruelty. And sometimes the unthinkable act is not destruction but mercy, not cruelty but kindness. And if you've listened to this story to the end, remember, there's always power in choosing compassion when the world chooses cruelty. And if you want to hear more stories like this of grit, hope, and unexpected redemption, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Because every story you hear here is another reminder that even in the darkest places, a single choice can change everything. The mornings on Samuel Briggs's ranch came quiet, with a red sun spilling across the horizon and dew shimmering like glass beads on the tall grass. And though Samuel had lived through hundreds of such mornings in silence, now each dawn was different. For the girl, whose name he learned was Eliza, had begun rising early to stand beside him on the porch, a faded blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes still carrying shadows from a life scarred by cruelty, but softening more with every sunrise. And Samuel never asked her about the places she had been or the hands that had hurt her, because sometimes healing does not come through questions but through silence, through letting a person breathe again without fear. Yet slowly in her own time Eliza began to speak, telling him in broken fragments about the men who traded her, the nights she wished not to wake, and how she had whispered those words, "Please, just make it quick," to every cruel face she thought might finally end it. And Samuel would simply listen, his weathered hands tightening around his coffee cup, his jaw clenching with the fury of a man who had seen enough of the world's darkness. And though he said little, his silence was stronger than words. It told her he was present, that she was not alone anymore, that he carried her pain in the quiet of his chest. Weeks turned into months, and Eliza's posture straightened. She learned to ride a stubborn mare that once threw every man who touched its reins. But under her careful hands the animal softened, just as she had, and Samuel often watched her from a distance, marveling at the strength he saw rising in her, the laughter that began to break through, shy at first, then freer, louder, echoing across the wide pastures like the sound of life returning. And he realized then that his $1 choice had not only saved her, but revived him, because for years he had lived like a ghost, going through the motions, feeding cattle, mending fences, burying himself in work to avoid the grief of losing his wife. But Eliza's presence had breathed warmth back into his days, reminding him what it meant to live for more than survival. Yet the town was not silent. Whispers followed him whenever he rode in for supplies. "That old fool," they muttered, "paid $1 for a broken girl. What's he really doing with her?" Some voices grew uglier, spitting suspicion and venom, because people are often cruelest to what they do not understand. And Samuel bore it all in silence, but Eliza heard the murmurs too. And one night, as they sat by the fire, she asked in a trembling voice, "Why don't you tell them the truth? Why don't you tell them I'm not what they think?" Samuel looked at her with eyes heavy as stone and said, "Because the truth don't need their approval, child. What matters is that you know it and I know it." Those words sank deep into her, stronger than any defense he could have spoken, and she realized then that Samuel had given her more than freedom. He had given her dignity, the right to exist without explanation. But as all stories of redemption go, peace does not last forever. One evening, as the sky boiled with thunderclouds and the prairie wind howled against the windows, riders came, 3 of them, men from the same group that had once traded Eliza like livestock, men who had heard she now lived on the Briggs ranch, and they wanted her back not because they cared for her, but because cruelty does not forgive those who escape it. And Samuel, standing at his porch with his shotgun resting against his arm, looked them in the eye and said, "You paid the world nothing for her. I paid $1. She's mine now, and I say she's free." But the men spat at his boots, snarling that no paper, no law, no God had given him that right. And the storm broke open above them, lightning cracking the sky as Eliza, trembling inside the doorway, whispered, "Samuel, they'll kill you." But Samuel only smiled, the weary, unflinching smile of a man who had lived long enough to know the worth of one final stand, and he said, "Then let it be for something that matters." And the standoff raged through the storm. Words turned to shouts, shouts turned to violence, and when the thunder quieted hours later, it was Samuel who stood bloodied but unbroken, the riders fleeing into the night, beaten not just by his hands but by the unshakable truth in his eyes, that he would not surrender her, that he would defy death itself before letting cruelty reclaim what he had saved. In the days after, the town's whispers turned into something else. Some still scoffed, but others began to respect him, to understand that perhaps the old rancher had done something braver than all their gossiping tongues combined. And Eliza, no longer just a girl rescued, began to walk taller, her face no longer only shadowed with sorrow but lit with the fire of survival. And one morning, as the sun rose and the ranch spread out before them like a promise, she turned to Samuel and said, "You didn't just save me, you gave me back myself." And Samuel, quiet as ever, only tipped his hat. But in his heart he knew, sometimes the unthinkable is not in taking life but in protecting it at all costs. And sometimes the strongest men are those who choose mercy over violence, dignity over cruelty, love over silence. And if this story touched you, if it reminded you that even in the loneliest corners of the world a single act of compassion can change 2 lives forever, then make sure you subscribe to this channel, because every story we tell here carries the same fire of hope, redemption, and the courage to do the unthinkable when it matters most.